William Cooper stood motionless, his figure framed by the massive window that overlooked the sprawling city of Boston. From this height, everything looked small, insignificant. The lights below flickered like distant stars, the traffic hummed faintly, and life moved on without him. His office, perched on the top floor of one of the city's tallest buildings, was luxurious but hollow, much like the man himself. He stared blankly at the city, but his mind wasn't in the present. It had drifted, as it often did, to that day 3 years ago. The memory always started the same: his wife, Emily, and their son, Michael, laughing in the car as they set off for the weekend trip. A trip they never returned from. The image was crystal clear in his mind, as if it had been etched there by a cruel hand. The screech of tires, the shattering of glass, and then silence. Boston, with all its vibrancy and movement, had become a backdrop to his grief. The city's muted tones mirrored his inner world, grey, cold, and endless. It had been 3 years, but nothing felt different. The noise of his success as a businessman drowned out the emptiness for others. But William knew. The promotions, the deals, the accolades, they all meant nothing. He was adrift. His gaze wandered to the clouds forming in the distance. Rain was coming. The thought of it, of the city washing clean under the downpour, stirred something faint in him. There was a time when rain had felt like a fresh start, like the world could reset with every drop. Now it was just a reminder of the unchangeable, of the things that couldn't be washed away. The soft hum of his phone vibrating on the desk pulled him from the fog of his thoughts. He didn't need to look to know it was another work call, another reminder of how disconnected he had become from the life around him. Without acknowledging it, he silenced the call. The world outside seemed to be drawing him out. For weeks, maybe months, he had avoided these moments, staying confined within his office or home, drowning himself in work. It had been easier to be numb. But today was different. Today, the pull was stronger. William ran a hand through his hair, noticing the streaks of grey that hadn't been there before the accident. He was only in his mid-40s, but grief had aged him, worn him down in ways no one could see. His colleagues still saw the polished exterior, the man who made decisions without hesitation, who commanded respect in every meeting. But inside, William had become a shadow of that man, hollow and waiting for a purpose he could no longer define. He turned away from the window and glanced around his office. The high ceilings, the leather chairs, the polished wood, it all seemed out of place now. Once it had symbolized achievement, a life's work. Now it felt like a mausoleum, holding him hostage to his memories. The rain picked up, but William didn't mind. Each drop seemed to pull him further from the hollow man he had become, washing away the layers of numbness he had wrapped around himself. There was no epiphany, no grand revelation, just the quiet acceptance that he was still here, still moving, and maybe, just maybe, still capable of feeling something. The rain fell in steady sheets, turning the pavement of Boston's streets into slick, reflective pools. The rhythm of his footsteps mirrored the distant hum of the city, a noise that barely registered in his mind. He didn't notice the cold seeping into his bones, nor the growing dampness in his clothes. He was far too accustomed to this numbness. His grief had been with him for so long it felt like part of his skin. The accident, Emily's laugh in the car, Michael's small hand in his, had taken everything from him, and even the passage of time had done little to ease the constant ache. Every corner of the city held memories, but tonight, under the heavy rain, it all blurred into one cold, grey expanse. As he walked past a line of closed storefronts, Something caught his eye. A small, huddled shape beneath an old, sagging cardboard box. At first, he thought it might just be trash left to decay in the storm, but the shape moved. A boy. William stopped. He looked closer and saw a child, curled up in a tight ball, shivering. Beside him, a dog lay with its head on the boy's knee, its fur matted and soaked through. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, his thin arms clutching his knees to his chest, as if trying to disappear into himself. For a moment, William just stood there, frozen in place. The rain pounded on, unrelenting, but this sight broke through the fog that had surrounded him for years. The boy didn't look up, didn't notice the man standing there, his whole focus on staying still, staying unnoticed. The scene felt too fragile, too delicate to disturb. But something inside William stirred. He knelt, lowering himself to the boy's level, and gently spoke, his voice barely louder than the rain. "Hey," he said softly. "Are you all right?" The boy flinched but didn't answer. He only tightened his grip around his knees, glancing nervously at the man. The dog, though watchful, didn't growl or bark. It simply raised its head, its tired eyes following William's movements. "Is this your dog?" William asked, nodding toward the animal. The boy nodded slightly, his chin barely lifting. "Rex." William looked down at Rex, who gave a small thump of his tail against the wet ground, as if acknowledging the introduction. William let out a slow breath. This wasn't something he was prepared for. How could he be? He barely knew how to handle his own emotions, let alone approach this frightened child in the street. "You can't stay here," William said gently. "It's too cold, and this rain won't stop any time soon." The boy looked away, his eyes darting between Rex and the cardboard box, as if weighing his options. William could see the hesitation in the boy's face, a mix of fear and uncertainty. "I have a warm place," William continued, his voice soft but steady. "You and Rex can come with me. You'll be safe." The boy looked up, his wide eyes filled with a quiet desperation. It was as if he wanted to believe William, wanted to trust him, but years of being alone had taught him otherwise. William knew that look. It was the same one he saw in the mirror each morning, the look of someone who had lost more than they could bear. Slowly, William stood and offered his hand. He didn't rush the boy, didn't force the moment. "What's your name?" "Johnny," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Johnny," William repeated with a small nod. "I'm William. You're safe with me, I promise." For a long, quiet moment, Johnny didn't move. His eyes flicked between William's hand and Rex, who now stood at his side. Then, slowly, cautiously, Johnny reached out and took William's hand. His grip was weak, his fingers cold, but it was a connection, a beginning. William gave a gentle tug, guiding Johnny to his feet. The boy wavered, but Rex stayed close, pressing against him. Together they walked to William's car, parked just a block away. The rain hadn't let up, but inside the car there was warmth, safety. As they drove through the quiet, wet streets, William glanced at Johnny, who was huddled in the back seat with Rex curled beside him. The boy's eyes were half closed, exhaustion taking over as the adrenaline of the moment faded. William turned his attention back to the road, but his mind raced with questions. Who was this boy? How long had he been out there, alone in the rain? The small bell above the door jingled softly as William Cooper stepped into the warm glow of the cafe. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, instantly calming his nerves. It was late afternoon, and the rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets glistening under the fading sunlight. He glanced around the cozy space, searching for his friend. "William!" a voice called out from behind the counter. Ethan Richards, the cafe's owner and William's oldest friend, waved him over with a smile. The cafe was quiet. A few regulars seated at tables scattered around, absorbed in their books or laptops. Johnny stood hesitantly by William's side, his small hand clutching at his damp jacket sleeve. Rex, the dog, sat obediently at Johnny's feet, his eyes following every movement. "Ethan, thanks for this," William said, approaching the counter. "We needed somewhere quiet." Ethan wiped his hands on a towel and came around to give William a quick embrace. "You know you're always welcome here." His eyes drifted to Johnny, softening with a curious sympathy. "And this must be Johnny." William nodded, glancing down at the boy. "Yeah. Johnny, this is my friend Ethan. He owns this place." Johnny, who had been unusually quiet since the car ride, looked up and gave a small nod. His eyes were wide, still guarded, as if trying to decide whether this new place was safe. William could sense the boy's wariness, a deep-rooted instinct from too much time spent alone. "You can sit wherever you like," Ethan said with a smile, clearly trying to put the boy at ease. "I'll bring over some hot chocolate." Johnny hesitated for a moment before he quietly followed William to a table near the window. They sat down, the light from outside casting soft shadows across the wood. Rex settled beside Johnny, resting his head on the boy's lap. There was a pause, a brief silence between them, broken only by the quiet clinking of cups and the soft murmur of conversation in the background. William watched Johnny for a few moments. The boy was so small, so fragile, and the weight of the world seemed to be pressing down on him. He knew this wasn't the time to push, but there were so many questions swimming in his mind. Who was Johnny? How long had he been on his own? And why did everything about him tug at something deep within William's chest? Ethan arrived with the hot chocolate, placing a cup in front of Johnny, along with a few marshmallows on the side. "On the house, kid," he said with a grin before heading back to the counter. Johnny murmured a soft, "Thank you," then wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. William took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the boy. He was still a mystery, a quiet, closed-off puzzle William couldn't solve. But today, something needed to break through. After a few minutes, William cleared his throat. "Johnny," he began gently, "I know you've been through a lot. I don't want to make you talk about anything you're not ready for, but I want to help. I need to know more about where you came from." Johnny didn't meet his gaze, staring instead into his cup. His fingers traced the rim of it slowly, as if gathering his thoughts. The silence stretched, and William worried he had pushed too soon. But then the boy spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't remember everything," Johnny said, his words slow, careful. "There was an accident, I think. A car. I was really little." William's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, keeping his voice steady. "An accident? What do you remember about it?" Johnny frowned, his small face creasing with concentration. It was dark. There was a lot of noise and fire. "I remember fire." His fingers tightened around the cup. "After that, I was taken to a place. It wasn't a good place." William's throat tightened. "What kind of place?" "The orphanage," Johnny said softly. "They didn't call me by my name there. I was just a number. They called me number 08. The words hung in the air like a weight, and William felt a chill run through him. A number! He could see the boy wasn't lying, but the idea of a child being stripped of their identity like that, reduced to a mere label, made something inside him twist with anger. "Number 08?" William repeated, trying to keep the frustration from his voice. "Is that what they called all the kids?" Johnny nodded, still staring into his cup. We were all numbers, no names. The image was horrifying, and yet William's mind was already racing, piecing things together. The fire, the accident. There were too many parallels. It reminded him too much of his own tragedy. But how could that be? He'd lost everything in that accident. His wife, his son, Michael. And yet, sitting across from him was this boy, this quiet, broken boy, whose story felt too close to his own for comfort. William's pulse quickened, memories flooding his mind, flashes of that terrible night, the flames, the broken glass, the feeling of helplessness as everything he loved was ripped away. He looked at Johnny, really looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. There was a familiarity in the way Johnny held himself, the quiet resilience in his eyes. Could it be? "Johnny," William said softly, his voice thick with emotion he tried to suppress. "Did anyone ever tell you what happened? Did they ever say who you were?" Johnny shook his head. "No, I don't know." William glanced at the clock as he pulled into his driveway, the engine's low hum fading as he turned off the ignition. The house before him, usually so quiet and empty, seemed even more still tonight. The rain had let up, leaving the streets slick and the air cool. He had left Johnny with Ethan at the cafe, figuring the boy needed a warm, safe place to rest. Ethan, ever the dependable friend, hadn't hesitated to offer help, but William couldn't shake the weight pressing down on him, the nagging questions that kept surfacing since meeting Johnny. As he stepped into the house, the familiar emptiness enveloped him. He hung up his coat and let out a long breath, his mind turning back to the orphanage Johnny had mentioned. Number Joe 8. The thought of a child being treated like that, stripped of his name, angered him in a way he hadn't expected. There was something about Johnny's story that didn't sit right with him, and the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. William walked over to his desk and sat down, opening his laptop. The screen's glow illuminated the room as he began searching for information on orphanages in the area. He typed the name Maplewood Children's Home into the search bar. It didn't take long for the first few articles to appear, but most of them were old, outdated reports on donations, volunteers, and other public-facing information that revealed nothing of substance. Frustration bubbled up inside him. He had hoped for something, anything, that could explain the strange circumstances surrounding Johnny. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He needed help, someone who could dig deeper than a few online searches. A name popped into his head. David Anderson. They hadn't spoken in a while, but David had always been reliable. He was still working in law enforcement, someone with the connections William desperately needed now. Without hesitation, William grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found David's number. It had been too long since they last spoke, but this wasn't a call he could put off. The phone rang a few times before a gruff voice answered on the other end. "William Cooper," David said, a hint of surprise in his tone. "Long time, no talk. What's going on?" "Hey, David," William replied, his voice sounding more tired than he expected. "Yeah, it's been a while. I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end, the brief silence filling with unspoken questions. "Go ahead," David finally said. "What do you need?" William hesitated for a moment, unsure how to frame his request without sounding paranoid. "It's about an orphanage," he began, his words careful. "I met this kid. Long story short, he's been through a lot, and something about his background doesn't sit right with me. He mentioned an orphanage, Maplewood Children's Home, and I think something's going on there. I need to find out more, and I'm hitting a wall." David hummed thoughtfully. "Maplewood, huh? I've heard of it. Can't say I've looked into it myself, but I know people who might have. What exactly are you looking for? William sighed, rubbing his temples. Anything. I just need to know if there's something off about it. The kid mentioned they called him by a number instead of his name. That can't be normal, right? No, that's definitely not normal, David agreed, his tone shifting to something more serious. All right, I'll ask around. See if anyone's got information on the place. But William, you sure you're ready to get into this? Sometimes these things go deeper than you'd expect. I'm sure, William said, though the knot in his stomach tightened. I can't just leave it alone, not after everything this kid's been through. David was quiet for a moment before speaking again. Okay, I'll reach out to a few people. It might take a couple of days, but I'll get back to you as soon as I know something. Thanks, David, William said, feeling a small sense of relief. I owe you one. You owe me a few, David joked lightly, but don't worry about it. I'll be in touch. The call ended, leaving William alone with the quiet hum of the house. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen, his mind still racing. Something about Johnny's past haunted him. There was a mystery here, something deeper than just a lost boy with a tragic history. William stood and made his way to the window, looking out at the darkened street. The rain had stopped, but the clouds lingered, heavy and low. He couldn't help but think of Johnny back at Ethan's cafe, curled up with Rex, trying to find some peace in a world that had been anything but kind to him. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about making sure the boy had a chance. Something William knew all too well could be taken away in an instant. As the hours ticked by, William couldn't shake the feeling that Johnny's story was only the beginning. And whatever answers he found, they were bound to lead him down a path he hadn't expected. The quiet returned to the house, but the unease lingered, settling deep within him like the storm clouds still hanging over the city. A few days later, David called back and told William go with him. The car ride to Maplewood Children's Home was heavy with unspoken tension. William gripped the wheel, his knuckles pale as he navigated the narrow streets of Philadelphia. Beside him, David sat silently, his eyes scanning the rundown buildings as they passed. Neither had spoken much since they left Boston, but the weight of their task was palpable. William's mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. When they finally arrived, the orphanage looked worse than he had imagined. The building was old, its bricks crumbling at the edges, and the windows were clouded with grime. It stood like a forgotten relic in a neighborhood that had long given up hope. A faded sign that read Maplewood Children's Home hung crookedly above the entrance. William cut the engine, his gaze fixed on the structure before him. This place looks abandoned. David nodded, his jaw set. It might as well be. They got out of the car and walked towards the entrance. The wind bit at their faces, carrying with it the faint sound of children's laughter, though it sounded hollow, almost forced. William's stomach twisted. This was no place for a child. Inside, the orphanage smelled of dampness and neglect. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the air felt heavy, stagnant. A lone receptionist sat behind a desk at the far end of the hall, her head buried in paperwork. She didn't look up as they approached. "We're here to see Susan Porter," David said, flashing his badge. The woman's eyes flicked to the badge for a brief second, then to William, before she finally rose from her seat. "I'll get her." They waited in silence, William's gaze wandering to the children in the corner of the room. They were small, too small for their age. Their clothes hung loosely on their frail bodies, and their faces were pale, drawn. One of them, no older than 7, watched William with wide, empty eyes. It was a look that chilled him, a look that spoke of too many nights spent in hunger, too many promises broken. David leaned in, his voice low. "They look sick." William nodded, unable to take his eyes off the boy. "Worse than sick. They look forgotten." A few minutes later, a woman appeared from the back hallway, Susan Porter. Her smile was thin and her eyes were sharp, assessing. She was well dressed, but there was something cold about her, something that set William on edge the moment she entered the room. "Detective Anderson," she greeted David with a nod. "And you must be Mr. Cooper. What brings you to Maplewood today?" William could feel the tension building, his instincts screaming that something was wrong here. He let David lead the conversation, for now. "We're here following up on some reports," David said. "There have been complaints about the conditions here. I'm sure you've heard them." Susan's smile didn't falter, but her gaze grew harder. "Maplewood is a state-run facility, Detective. We follow every protocol." "Yet there have been whispers," David pressed. "Rumors about illegal adoptions, mishandling of records. We need to take a look at your files." Susan's lips tightened, just for a moment. "Those are serious accusations, Detective. I can assure you, everything here is done by the book. But if you insist on inspecting our records, I'll have to get approval from my supervisors." William watched her closely, noting the way her fingers twitched slightly at her sides, the subtle flicker of unease in her eyes. She was lying. He knew it. "I'd like to see the children's living quarters," William said, his voice steady but firm. Susan hesitated, then gestured toward the hallway. "Of course, Mr. Cooper, but I'm afraid it won't be anything new to you. Our funding is limited." As they followed her through the dimly lit corridors, the sense of unease only grew. The rooms were small, cramped, with bunk beds stacked against the walls. Thin blankets were piled on thin mattresses. It was no place for a child to grow up. "They seem malnourished," William said, his eyes scanning the rooms. Susan stopped in her tracks, turning to face him. Her smile was gone now, replaced by a hard, calculating expression. "Mr. Cooper," she said, her voice low, "you seem like a man who knows when to stop asking questions. I suggest you remember that." The threat hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. William held her gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not stopping," he replied quietly, but firmly. Susan's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. She turned and continued down the hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. William and David followed, but the unease settled deeper into William's chest. Something was very wrong here. As they left the orphanage, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the building. William glanced back at the children still playing in the courtyard, their laughter distant, haunting. "Something's off," William muttered to David as they got into the car. David nodded grimly. "I know. But we'll get to the bottom of it." And William knew they had to. Whatever was happening inside those walls, it was far from over. The house in Westwood had always felt too big. Since Emily and Michael were gone, the empty halls echoed with a silence William could never quite escape. But tonight, something had shifted. The once cold, vacant spaces held a different energy, filled with the soft sounds of life again. The faint crackle of the fireplace, the quiet breath of a boy asleep on the couch, and the gentle padding of Rex's paws as he circled protectively at Johnny's feet. William stood in the doorway, watching Johnny as he slept. The boy's small frame curled into the cushions, his face relaxed in a way that it hadn't been when he'd first arrived. Rex lay close by, one eye half open, as if, even in rest, he refused to leave Johnny unguarded. William exhaled, quietly. The boy was starting to feel like he belonged here, not just as a guest, but as something more. William wasn't sure when it had started, but he could feel it, the slow, tentative bond forming between them. Johnny wasn't just the frightened, distant child who had shown up soaked in rain that night. He was more. And as the days passed, William found himself drawn into the mystery of Johnny's past and the strange familiarity that haunted his thoughts. He crossed the room and sat in the armchair across from Johnny, careful not to wake him. His eyes traced the boy's features, his brow furrowed slightly, his hands curled around the edge of the blanket. There was something in his face, the shape of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, that stirred something deep within William. It wasn't just the resemblance, it was the way Johnny looked at him sometimes, the way he trusted him, despite everything the boy must have gone through. William didn't need to ask to know Johnny had seen too much, had been through too much for someone so young. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Johnny," he whispered, not loud enough to wake him, but loud enough to hear the weight of the name in the quiet room. As if sensing the thought, Rex shifted, his nose nudging Johnny's hand gently. The boy stirred, his eyes blinking open slowly. For a brief moment, confusion flickered across his face before recognition set in, and he relaxed. "Hey," William said softly. "You all right?" Johnny nodded, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, just a dream." William hesitated before speaking again, his voice quiet, cautious. "Do you remember what it was about?" Johnny's gaze dropped, his fingers absently stroking Max's fur. "It was the accident," he murmured. "I saw it, like I always do." William felt a chill run through him. He had been waiting for this, for Johnny to say more, to open up about the thing they had both been skirting around. The accident. "Do you want to talk about it?" William asked gently. Johnny looked at him, his eyes searching William's face for something, maybe reassurance, maybe trust. Slowly he nodded. "I don't remember all of it," Johnny began, his voice low, steady. "But I remember the car. It was raining and everything happened so fast. I heard the crash. And then I was just alone." William's heart tightened. He didn't push Johnny for more. Instead, he let the boy speak at his own pace, feeling the weight of each word as it settled between them. "I don't know how I got out," Johnny continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "But when I woke up, I wasn't with them anymore. I was somewhere else." William's chest ached with the unsaid, the missing pieces, the gaps in the story. But he didn't need to hear it all to understand what the boy had gone through. He had lived through his own loss, and now he saw the same pain reflected in Johnny. "You're safe here, Johnny," William said after a long pause. "Whatever happened, whatever you've been through, I'm going to find out the truth." Johnny's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time there was a flicker of something like hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. "Promise?" Johnny whispered. William leaned forward, his voice steady, resolute. "I promise. I'll keep you safe. And we'll figure this out together." As the boy settled back into the cushions, Rex curled up next to him, and William felt a quiet resolve wash over him. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across William Cooper's study, the warm light doing little to ease the chill that had settled deep in his bones. The stack of papers on his desk, recently delivered by David Anderson, held the weight of secrets that had been buried too long. As William sat down, his hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to focus, to read, and to finally understand the truth about the boy who had unexpectedly entered his life. David had warned him that the information would be hard to digest, But nothing could have prepared William for what he was about to uncover. The first few pages were routine: notes on the orphanage, reports of inspections that had found nothing out of the ordinary. But then the tone of the documents shifted, and William's heart began to race. The file marked Maplewood Investigative Report. Detailed allegations of illegal adoptions and suspicious activities linked to the orphanage. There were records of children being moved in and out under the radar, their identities erased, replaced by numbers. His eyes narrowed as he read further. The name Susan Porter, the director of the orphanage, came up repeatedly, and the deeper he delved, the more her involvement in these activities became apparent. But it was the reference to a particular child that stopped William cold. Number 08. The file outlined a case where a young boy had survived a fatal accident, an incident that was eerily similar to the one that had claimed the lives of his wife and son. The description was vague, intentionally so, but the details that were included, a dark-haired boy, approximately 4 years old, no known relatives, set off alarm bells in William's mind. He stared at the document, trying to make sense of it. Could it be a coincidence? He wanted to believe it was, but the more he read, the less he could deny the growing suspicion gnawing at him. The boy had been taken to Maplewood, stripped of his identity, and referred to only as number 08. There was no mention of what had happened to him afterward, but the file hinted at something darker, something that made William's blood run cold. Johnny had mentioned being called a number, but William had dismissed it as a cruel quirk of the orphanage. Now, that number took on a new, horrifying significance. He could barely focus on the words as they blurred before his eyes, his mind racing through possibilities. Could Johnny really be? William forced himself to stop. He couldn't allow himself to jump to conclusions. Not yet. But the coincidences were piling up, too many to ignore. His pulse quickened and his breath came in shallow bursts as the truth edged closer. He shuffled through the remaining papers, desperate for more information, for anything that could confirm or disprove his fears. Then he found it, a single yellowed report from a police investigation into the accident that had taken his family. The report mentioned a survivor, a young boy, though the details had been obscured. The name of the orphanage had been redacted, but there was no mistaking it. Everything pointed back to Maplewood. William's heart pounded in his chest as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The boy who had survived, the boy who had been taken in by the orphanage. Could it really be Johnny? Could it be his son, Michael, whom he had thought lost forever? His hands trembled as he reached for the phone, dialing David's number with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. It rang twice before David picked up, his voice calm and steady, as if he had been expecting this call. "David." William's voice was tight, barely controlled. "I found something I can't ignore. There's a file here, a report about a boy, a survivor from the accident. It matches Johnny's story too closely. I need to know more." There was a pause on the other end, a heavy silence that spoke volumes. "I was afraid you'd find that," David finally said, his voice somber. "I didn't want to say anything until you had all the facts, but it looks like the dots are connecting themselves." William's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean? Do you think it's possible that Johnny could be—" "I don't know," David admitted, his tone careful. "But I can tell you this much. Maplewood has been under investigation for years, and we've only scratched the surface. If there's a chance that Johnny is connected to your past, we need to find out. I've already started digging deeper, but it's going to take time. Susan Porter's not going to give us anything willingly." William's mind raced as he tried to process everything. The hope that had begun to bloom in his chest was fragile, threatened by the weight of doubt and fear. "I can't just sit here, David," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. I need answers. I understand, David replied. But you need to be careful. If Johnny is who you think he might be, then there are people who won't want this to come to light. We have to do this by the book, or we risk losing everything. William nodded, though David couldn't see him. I'll confront Susan, he said, his voice steadier now. I need to know what she's been hiding. If she's involved, she needs to answer for it. Be careful, William, David warned. Susan's not someone you want to corner without a plan. I'll back you up as much as I can, but tread lightly. William ended the call, the determination solidifying in his chest. He couldn't let this go, not now, not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. William Cooper stood outside the orphanage, his hand gripping the steering wheel tightly. The old building loomed before him, its worn facade a stark contrast to the secrets it held within. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the deserted street, but William wasn't waiting for daylight to confront Susan Porter. He had waited long enough. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the cold morning air biting at his skin. Every step toward the front door felt heavier, burdened by the weight of what he had uncovered. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't leave without answers. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the familiar, musty smell of the orphanage hitting him immediately. It was quiet inside, almost too quiet, as if the place was holding its breath. He walked down the dimly lit hallway, his footsteps echoing off the walls, until he reached Susan's office. He didn't knock. Susan looked up from her desk, startled by his sudden entrance. Her eyes quickly shifted from surprise to irritation, but William could see the flicker of unease beneath her calm facade. She had been expecting him, or at least she knew this day would come. "William," she said coolly, setting down her pen. "I didn't realize we had a meeting scheduled." "We don't," William replied, his voice low but firm. He closed the door behind him and took a step closer to her desk. "But we need to talk. Now." Susan leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. "I'm not sure what you think you're doing, barging in here like this. If you have something to say, say it." William's jaw tightened as he struggled to contain the anger bubbling inside him. He had imagined this moment 100 times, but now that it was here, the words felt tangled in his throat. He forced himself to focus, to keep his voice steady. "I know about the illegal adoptions," he said slowly, watching her reaction. "I know what you've been doing here. The children, Johnny, they were never just orphans, were they? They were commodities." Susan's eyes narrowed, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she leaned forward, her tone sharp. "You don't understand the situation, William. You think this is just about a few lost children? It's much bigger than that." "Don't patronize me," William snapped, his patience wearing thin. "I've seen the files, Susan. I know about number 08. I know what you did to him, to all of them. How can you justify it? How can you live with yourself?" For a moment, Susan's composure cracked. Her eyes flickered with something that looked like guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She straightened in her chair, her voice hardening. "Do you think I had a choice?" she spat. "Do you think I wanted this? I did what I had to do to survive. We all did. You have no idea what it's like to be caught in the middle of something so much bigger than yourself. These children, they were valuable. They had connections, backgrounds that made them worth more than just another orphan. It wasn't just about money. It was about power." "Power?" William repeated, incredulous. "You're talking about power while these children's lives were destroyed?" "Johnny was just a boy, Susan. How can you stand there and justify ruining his life?" Susan looked away, her gaze shifting to the window. You think I had control over any of this? There are people out there, William. Powerful people who pull the strings. I'm just a small part of it. A cog in the machine. Who? William demanded, his voice rising. Who's behind this? Who's responsible for what happened to Johnny? Susan hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. For a moment, William thought she might tell him, that she might finally reveal the truth he had been searching for. But then her expression shifted, and he saw the fear in her eyes. There's someone they call M, she whispered, her voice trembling. He's the one who controls it all, the trafficking, the adoptions, everything. But you can't fight him, William. You can't win. Who is he? William pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. Tell me, Susan. If you know who he is, you have to tell me. But Susan shook her head, her eyes distant. It's too late. It's too late for all of us. Before William could react, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small bottle of pills. His heart leapt into his throat as he realized what she was about to do. Susan, don't, he started, but she was already unscrewing the cap. She looked up at him, her expression strangely calm, as if she had made peace with her decision. I'm sorry, William, but this is the only way out. William lunged forward, trying to stop her, but he was too late. She swallowed the pills in one swift motion, her hand trembling as she dropped the empty bottle on the desk. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her, but her eyes were already glazing over, her body going limp in his grip. No, 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 William muttered, panic rising in his chest. He lowered her to the floor, his hands fumbling for his phone to call for help. But deep down, he knew it was useless. She had made her choice. As Susan's breathing grew shallow, William knelt beside her, helplessly watching as the life drained from her eyes. Her final words echoed in his mind, haunting him. The name hung in the air like a dark cloud, a shadow over everything he had uncovered. He stayed there beside her until the paramedics arrived. But by then, it was too late. Susan Porter was gone, taking the last of her secrets with her. As the authorities moved in, William stood outside the orphanage, staring into the distance. He had come looking for answers, but all he had found were more questions. The truth was out there, just beyond his reach, and now, more than ever, he knew he couldn't stop until he found it. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait and prepare for the battle that lay ahead. The shadows had grown deeper, and the fight was far from over. William Cooper sat across from David Anderson in the dimly lit back room of a diner that had seen better days. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and fried food, but neither man paid any attention to it. Their focus was on the documents spread out before them, pages filled with names, dates, and connections that formed a dark web of corruption. David tapped his pen against the table, his brow furrowed in concentration. So, M is Richard Harris, he said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. The pieces fit. Harris has been under the radar for years, always just out of reach. But this could bring him down. William nodded, his gaze fixed on a photograph of Harris, an older man with slicked back hair, a sharp suit, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Harris was everything William despised. A man who used his wealth and influence to exploit others, leaving ruin in his wake. The thought of Johnny being just another pawn in Harris's twisted game made William's blood boil. We have to be careful, David continued, his voice low. Harris is dangerous, and he's surrounded by people who will protect him at all costs. We can't afford any mistakes. William's jaw tightened as he studied the man in the photograph. I'm not looking to make any. This ends now. David nodded, understanding the resolve in William's voice. There's an event tonight, one of Harris's high society gatherings. It's the perfect opportunity to get close to him, but it's also risky. You're sure you want to do this? William didn't hesitate. I'll do whatever it takes to bring him down. I owe it to Johnny and to every other child he's hurt. They spent the next hour going over the plan, meticulously covering every detail. David had managed to secure an invitation to the event under a false name, giving William the access he needed. The goal was simple: get inside, find evidence that linked Harris to the trafficking ring, and get out without raising suspicion. But both men knew that things rarely went according to plan. As night fell, William found himself outside the grand entrance of Harris's estate, the massive mansion bathed in soft golden light. The event was already in full swing, with luxury cars pulling up and dropping off guests dressed in their finest. William adjusted the collar of his suit, his nerves a mix of adrenaline and dread. He was walking into the lion's den, and there would be no room for error. He handed the forged invitation to the doorman, who barely glanced at it before nodding and waving him inside. The interior of the mansion was even more opulent than William had imagined: crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and art that screamed wealth and power. The air was filled with the sound of classical music, the clink of glasses, and the low murmur of conversation. But William wasn't here to admire the decor. He moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning the room for Harris. It didn't take long to spot him: a tall figure standing near the fireplace, surrounded by a group of sycophants hanging on his every word. Harris looked every bit the part of the untouchable businessman, exuding confidence and charm. But William saw through the facade, saw the predator lurking beneath the polished exterior. William approached cautiously, keeping his expression neutral as he edged closer to the group. He could hear snippets of Harris's conversation, discussions about investments, political influence, and other matters of the elite, but nothing that pointed to his darker dealings. Harris's eyes flicked over to William as he joined the group, his gaze sharp and assessing. "I don't believe we've met," Harris said, his voice smooth. "Richard Harris." William extended his hand, keeping his tone polite. "William Thompson. I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Harris." Harris smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "All good things, I hope." William returned the smile, though it felt like a mask. "On who you ask." There was a flicker of something in Harris's eyes, a brief moment of calculation, but he quickly brushed it aside. "Well, I'm always happy to meet someone new. What line of work are you in, Mr. Thompson?" "Investment consulting," William replied smoothly, a cover he and David had agreed upon. "I've been looking to expand my network, and I was told your events are the place to be." Harris chuckled, his arrogance palpable. "Whoever told you that was right." William continued the small talk, carefully probing for any sign that Harris might slip up. But the man was too seasoned, too practiced. It became clear that getting him to reveal anything incriminating in public was a long shot. As the conversation continued, William's eyes wandered around the room, subtly taking in the layout. He noticed a hallway leading off to the side, away from the main event. It was guarded, but not heavily. That was where he needed to go. "Excuse me for a moment," William said, slipping away from the group as casually as he could. Harris barely acknowledged his departure, already moving on to the next conversation. William moved quickly, keeping his head down as he made his way toward the hallway. The guard at the entrance gave him a brief once-over, but didn't stop him as William flashed the fake credentials David had provided. The hallway was quieter, the noise of the party fading as he moved deeper into the mansion. He reached Harris's private study, a room he had been told housed the documents he needed. The door was locked, but William had anticipated that. He pulled out a small toolkit, his hands steady as he worked on the lock. Within moments, the door clicked open, and he slipped inside. The study was dark, the only light coming from a faint glow of the streetlights outside. William moved quickly, scanning the room for anything that might hold the evidence he needed. It didn't take long to find the safe, a sleek, modern model hidden behind a bookshelf. He worked quickly, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he cracked the safe. The door swung open, revealing a stack of files and a small flash drive. William grabbed both, his heart pounding as he stuffed them into his jacket. But as he turned to leave, the sound of footsteps outside the door made him freeze. He pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath as the footsteps paused outside. For a tense moment, he thought he had been caught, but then the footsteps continued down the hall. William exhaled slowly, waiting until the coast was clear before slipping out of the study and back into the hallway. He moved quickly, retracing his steps until he was back at the party, blending into the crowd as if nothing had happened. He couldn't afford to stay any longer. The evidence was in his hands, and now he had to get out. He made his way to the exit, his heart pounding with each step. The air outside was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped him inside. As he walked away from the mansion, the files and flash drive safely tucked in his jacket, William allowed himself a small breath of relief. He had what he needed to expose Harris, to bring the entire operation crashing down. But he knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was just beginning, and there would be no turning back. The night was still, the air heavy with the tension of impending confrontation. William Cooper stood in the shadows outside the warehouse, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold metal of the pistol in his hand felt foreign, but he gripped it tightly, knowing this was the final step in his journey. Everything had led to this moment, the lies, the betrayals, the truths he had uncovered. Now it was time to end it. Beside him, David Anderson kept his eyes on the building. The place was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had been swirling around them for weeks. The plan was simple, but fraught with risk. They had enough evidence to bring Richard Harris down, to dismantle the trafficking ring once and for all. But William knew Harris wouldn't go down without a fight. "You ready?" David asked, his voice low, steady. William nodded, his jaw clenched. "Let's do this." They moved silently toward the entrance, the faint sound of police sirens in the distance, signaling that backup was on its way. But William didn't plan to wait. This was personal. The door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing the dimly lit interior of the warehouse. It was a maze of crates and shadows, the perfect place for a final showdown. William's pulse quickened as they navigated through the narrow corridors, every nerve on edge. He could feel the weight of what was to come pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside, focusing only on the task at hand. As they rounded a corner, the figure of Richard Harris came into view. He stood at the center of the warehouse, flanked by two of his men, his posture relaxed, almost casual. But William could see the sharpness in his eyes, the calculating mind at work behind the facade of calm. "So, you finally made it," Harris said, his voice carrying a note of amusement. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve, William." William stepped forward, his gaze locked on Harris. "This ends now, Harris. It's over." Harris chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound. "Over? You think you can just walk in here and shut me down? You have no idea what you're up against. I've been doing this for years, long before you even knew the name M. And I'm not about to let it all crumble because of you. David spoke up, his voice firm. We have everything we need to put you away for the rest of your life, Harris. The police are on their way. There's no escape. But Harris wasn't fazed. He tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. I think you're underestimating me, David. You see, people like me don't get caught. We don't go to prison. We just adapt. William's grip on the pistol tightened. Enough. This is your last chance, Harris. Surrender, and maybe the court will show you some mercy. But I won't. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Harris's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure, cold rage. Mercy, he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. You think I need your mercy? You're nothing, William. Just a man clinging to a lost cause, and you're too late. Even if you take me down, there are others, people more powerful than you can imagine. You can't stop this. But William didn't waver. He stepped closer, the gun steady in his hand. You're wrong, Harris. It ends with you. Right here, right now. Harris's eyes flickered with something that might have been fear, but it was gone in an instant. He gave a small nod to one of his men, and in a split second, chaos erupted. The man lunged at William, but David was faster. A single shot rang out, echoing through the warehouse, and the attacker fell to the ground, his weapon clattering to the floor. Harris's other guard hesitated, then turned to run, but William was already moving. He raised his pistol, firing once, twice, until the man crumpled in the doorway. But Harris didn't run. He stood his ground, his expression unreadable as William advanced on him. It's over, Harris, William said again, his voice low, filled with the finality of the moment. Harris sneered, but there was no more bravado in his eyes. You think this makes you a hero, William? You think taking me down will change anything? William didn't respond. He just stared at the man who had caused so much pain, so much suffering, and felt a cold, hard resolve settle over him. This man, this monster, had taken everything from him, his family, his peace, his sense of justice. And now it was time to make him pay. As the sound of approaching sirens grew louder, Harris made one last desperate move, reaching for a concealed weapon. But William was ready. He fired, the bullet finding its mark in Harris's chest, and the man staggered back, a look of shock on his face as he crumpled to the floor. The room fell silent, the echoes of the gunshots fading into the distance. William stood over Harris's body, his heart pounding in his chest, the reality of what he had done slowly sinking in. David stepped forward, placing a hand on William's shoulder. It's over, William. You did it. But William didn't feel any relief, only a deep, aching emptiness. He had won, but the cost had been high, too high. He holstered his weapon and turned away, his mind already drifting to the one person who mattered now, Johnny, Michael. As the police stormed the warehouse, taking Harris's men into custody and securing the scene, William walked out into the cool night air. He looked up at the sky, the stars shining brightly above, and felt the weight of the past lift, if only slightly. He drove straight to Ethan's place, where Johnny, no Michael, was waiting. The boy was asleep on the couch, Rex curled up at his feet. William stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching him, the familiar features now unmistakable. He knelt beside his son, gently brushing a lock of hair from the boy's forehead. Michael stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment there was confusion, but then recognition dawned, and the boy's face lit up with a smile. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice small, hopeful. William's heart swelled with emotion, but he kept his voice steady. Yeah, it's me. I'm here, Michael. Michael reached out and William took his hand, holding it tightly. The boy's grip was strong, reassuring, and, for the first time in years, William felt a sense of peace. They didn't need to say anything more. The past was behind them, and now they had a future to build, together. As William sat there holding his son's hand, he made a silent vow. No matter what, he would protect Michael. He would ensure that no other child would ever suffer as they had. It was a promise he intended to keep, no matter the cost. The dawn was breaking, a new day beginning, and with it, a new chapter in their lives. William knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it, ready to embrace the future and the hope it brought with it. And that's the story of a father's relentless pursuit for justice and a long-lost son's return. What an emotional roller coaster, right? Stories like these remind us of the strength of the human spirit, the power of love, and the lengths we're willing to go to protect the ones we care about. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and, of course, subscribe for more stories just like this one. Every week, we dive into narratives that challenge us, move us, and make us think about the world and our place in it a little differently. Until next time, stay inspired, stay curious, and as always, keep chasing those powerful stories that make life a little more meaningful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.